Nathaniel Hayes lived a life of extravagant luxury in his sprawling estate. Yet deep within, he felt a void that no amount of wealth could fill. That morning, Nathaniel found himself wrestling with a persistent thought that refused to leave him. What will happen to everything I've built when I'm gone? He had no one to pass it on to, and the question haunted him more with each passing day. Lost in his thoughts, the sound of footsteps echoed through the grand hall. Glancing out of his office window, Nathaniel spotted Elena Parker, a 25-year-old housemaid, carefully polishing the ornate crystal chandelier. Elena had been working at the estate for several months, someone Nathaniel barely noticed in his day-to-day life. But today, something about her caught his attention. Her unwavering focus, the graceful way she moved, and the quiet determination in her posture seemed to contrast starkly with the excessive, indulgent world he inhabited. Nathaniel's gaze lingered on her longer than it should have, and an idea began to form in his mind. She could be the answer to my problem. Elena was young, healthy, and appeared uninterested in impressing him. He envisioned a straightforward arrangement. She could have his child in exchange for a life-changing sum of money. Afterward, she could leave, free to live her life while the child stayed with him. Nathaniel mulled over the idea, convinced of its practicality. Unaware of his scrutiny, Elena continued her work. For her, the job at the Hayes estate was a lifeline. Her modest salary barely covered the rent for the tiny apartment she shared with her ailing mother. Most of her earnings went toward buying the medication her mother desperately needed, but it wasn't enough. Her mother's condition was worsening, and the doctors had made it clear. Surgery was her only hope, and without it, survival wasn't guaranteed. Elena worked tirelessly, sacrificing her own comfort to save every penny she could, but the amount required for her mother's surgery was far beyond what she could dream of earning. Still, she refused to give up. Her mother was all she had, and Elena was determined to do whatever it took to save her. That evening, as Elena finished cleaning and prepared to leave, Nathaniel stepped into the hall. He rarely addressed his staff directly, so his sudden presence startled her. "Elena," he said, his firm tone breaking the silence, "come to my office. I need to speak with you." A chill ran down her spine. His tone was serious, almost commanding. Nervously, Elena nodded, wiping her hands on her apron before following him. As she stepped into the grand office, Elena felt dwarfed by the imposing space. The high shelves lined with books, the large dark mahogany desk, and the sheer grandeur of the room made her feel insignificant. Nathaniel sat behind the desk, his posture stiff and his face unreadable. "Sit down," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from him. Elena obeyed, clasping her hands tightly in her lap as she waited for him to speak. "I'll get straight to the point," Nathaniel began bluntly. "I want you to have my child." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Elena blinked, convinced she must have misheard him. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I want you to have my child," Nathaniel repeated with the calm demeanor of someone proposing a business deal. "I'm not interested in relationships. They don't work for me. But I need someone to carry on my legacy, and I believe you're the ideal person." Elena stared at him in disbelief. "I don't understand," she finally managed to say. Nathaniel shrugged as though the answer were obvious. "You're discreet, trustworthy, and have no personal ties to me. I want to keep things simple. In return, you'll receive a substantial sum of money, enough to completely change your life." Elena's heart raced. Money. The very thing she desperately needed. But this was insanity. How could she even begin to consider such an absurd proposition? "And what happens afterward?" she asked, her voice trembling as she tried to stay composed. "After the child is born, they'll stay with me," Nathaniel replied without hesitation. "You'll get the money and will be free to move on with your life. I don't want any complications." Elena was at a loss for words. A part of her wanted to shout, to tell him how cruel and unthinkable his offer was. But another part of her, the part that thought about her mother's deteriorating health, the unpaid rent, and the dwindling supply of medication, forced her to pause. I don't know," she stammered, her thoughts in turmoil. This is too much." Nathaniel studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Feeling lost and overwhelmed, Nathaniel Hayes watched Elena Parker in silence for a moment before breaking the tense quiet. "Think about it, Elena. he said, his tone firm but measured. I'm offering you a once-in-a-lifetime chance to change your circumstances. Elena didn't respond. His words lingered in her mind like an echo she couldn't shake, but the weight of what he was proposing felt impossible to process. Sensing there was nothing more to say, Nathaniel concluded, You don't need to answer now. Take a few days, but keep in mind, this offer won't stay open forever. Elena left the room in a daze, her thoughts racing as she made her way back to her small quarters in the estate. The proposal was outrageous, completely surreal. Yet, as she sat on her bed that night, staring at the faded wallpaper and hearing her mother's faint coughs through the phone, she realized this might be her only option. The entire night passed without sleep. Nathaniel's words played on a loop in her mind. I want you to have my child. It was unthinkable, yet the crushing reality of her mother's declining health made it difficult to dismiss. The sun had barely risen when Elena found herself at her small desk, staring at an old photograph of her mother. In the picture, they were both smiling, happy, carefree, and worlds away from the struggles they now faced. A lump formed in her throat, and she closed her eyes, willing the tears to stay at bay. All she wanted was to save her mother, to give her a chance to live. But at what cost? Part of her whispered that accepting Nathaniel's offer would be a sacrifice beyond comprehension, but ultimately necessary. Another part screamed that it was wrong, that it would mean giving away something priceless. As she wrestled with her thoughts, the shrill ring of her phone broke the silence. It was the clinic. Miss Parker, the receptionist began, her tone polite but firm. We're calling to remind you that the deadline for confirming your mother's surgery is fast approaching. Without payment, I'm afraid we can't guarantee her recovery. A date has been tentatively reserved, but we need confirmation and payment soon. Elena thanked the receptionist and hung up, her chest tightening as the urgency of the situation became clearer. Time was slipping away, and she had barely managed to scrape together a fraction of what was needed. Without the surgery, her mother wouldn't survive. Later that day, Elena returned to the mansion, her steps heavy with the weight of the decision looming over her. She found Nathaniel in his office, standing by the grand window overlooking the estate gardens. Hearing her enter, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Come in, Elena, he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. Have you made your decision? She hesitated, then slowly walked forward and sat down. Taking a deep breath, she tried to steady her trembling hands. Not yet, she admitted, but I need to understand exactly what you're proposing. Nathaniel nodded, as though expecting the question. He sat down as well, his hands resting on the polished desk. It's simple, he began, his voice calm and businesslike. There will be no physical involvement between us. The process will be handled through artificial insemination. During the pregnancy, you'll have access to full medical care, housing, and all necessary support. After the baby is born, you'll receive the agreed-upon sum of money and be free to move on with your life. The child will remain with me, and you'll have no legal responsibilities or rights over them. His words were clinical, cold, and painfully precise. Elena listened, trying to make sense of the man sitting in front of her. He seemed so composed, so sure that what he was offering was entirely reasonable, but to her it was anything but simple. Can I have a little more time to think? She asked, rising slowly from her seat. Nathaniel nodded. Of course, but don't take too long. That night, Elena lay awake again, her mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. She knew what she had to do, even if it made her stomach churn with dread. She couldn't live with herself if she let her mother die, knowing there had been a way to save her. The next morning, she went about her tasks as usual, though her decision weighed heavily on her. By mid-afternoon, she found herself standing outside Nathaniel's office. Taking a deep breath, she knocked lightly before stepping inside. He was reviewing a stack of documents but immediately put them down when he saw her. His gaze was steady, his demeanor as composed as ever. Well? He asked, his hands clasped on the desk. I accept, Elena said, her voice firm despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her directness, but he didn't ask for an explanation. To him, everything was a matter of logic and mutual benefit. Excellent, he said, retrieving a folder from a nearby drawer. This is the contract. Read it carefully. I want to ensure every detail is clear before we proceed. Elena took the document with trembling hands. As she read, her eyes skimmed over every clause. The support she would receive, the payment details, the legal stipulations ensuring she would have no claims over the child. It was all meticulously outlined, leaving no room for ambiguity. When she finished, she looked up at Nathaniel, who handed her a pen. Her hands shook as she hesitated, but with a deep breath she signed. The room fell silent. The pen in her hand felt heavier than it should, and the weight of her decision settled over her like a thick fog. Nathaniel, however, took the contract and filed it away with the calm efficiency of a man closing another business deal. "It's done," he said simply. "It's done," he said, slipping the signed contract into a sleek folder. "From now on, all the arrangements will be handled to ensure everything proceeds smoothly." Elena said nothing, her heart pounding in her chest. She had made this decision consciously, but the sense of crossing a line of no return was suffocating. The money was desperately needed, her mother's life depended on it. The rent was overdue again. Yet none of that alleviated the storm of inner conflict. Nathaniel stood, adjusting his tie with the precision of a man preparing to tackle his next task. He paused just before she reached the door. "Elena, I want you to know," he said, his voice calm but authoritative, "everything will be done to ensure your comfort. Whatever you need, just ask." Elena nodded, though his words barely registered. They seemed to float in the air, unable to penetrate the chaos of her thoughts. As she left his office and walked through the grand corridors of the estate, the weight of her decision pressed down on her. For her, there was no alternative. This was the only way forward. That night, in the small, sparsely furnished room she occupied in the Hayes estate, Elena lay staring at the ceiling. Signing the contract should have brought relief, but instead, a knot twisted in her stomach. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed her mother's number. "Hello, sweetheart." Her mother's weak but warm voice came through the line. The sound was a mix of comfort and heartbreak. "Hi, Mom," Elena replied, forcing a calm tone. "I just wanted to check on you. How are you feeling today?" "A little tired, but I'm okay," her mother answered gently. "And you, dear? You're not overworking yourself, are you?" Elena swallowed hard, trying to suppress the wave of guilt. She couldn't bring herself to tell her mother the truth. "I'm fine, Mom. Everything's under control." After they hung up, the tears came, silent but uncontrollable. Hearing her mother's voice had strengthened her resolve, even as it deepened her pain. She was doing this for her mother. Everything was for her. No matter how high the cost, it would be worth it if her mother survived. Nathaniel, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to Elena's inner turmoil. That evening, he meticulously reviewed the contract she had signed, double-checking every clause to ensure there were no loopholes or ambiguities. It was almost an obsessive ritual, yet his thoughts weren't entirely focused on the words. Her expression as she signed the contract kept replaying in his mind, a mixture of determination and anguish that unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. The following morning, Nathaniel wasted no time. He arranged for the best specialists to begin the artificial insemination process, ensuring that every detail was handled with precision. When he informed Elena of the first appointment, he made it clear that he would accompany her. "I don't think it's necessary," Elena said, her voice tight. "I can go alone." "I want to make sure everything is handled properly," Nathaniel replied, his tone brooking no argument. The drive to the clinic was steeped in silence. Elena stared out the window, avoiding Nathaniel's presence beside her. He, on the other hand, seemed perfectly comfortable, as if it were just another routine matter. At the clinic, the doctor explained the procedure in detail. Elena listened intently, asking occasional questions, while Nathaniel sat quietly, observing. He only spoke once, ensuring that every step would be thoroughly documented. The procedure went smoothly, and a few weeks later, Elena received the news. The insemination had been successful. A life was now growing inside her. Relief mixed with a deep sense of dread. It was real. And eventually, she would have to let the child go. In the months that followed, Elena tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, continuing her work at the estate. But the pregnancy brought inevitable changes, both physical and emotional. Her interactions with Nathaniel remained formal, though she began to notice subtle shifts in his behavior. He started asking how she was feeling and began appearing at her medical appointments with increasing regularity. His gestures, while understated, hinted at a growing attentiveness. Elena, however, refused to dwell on their significance. One afternoon, while resting in the estate's garden, Nathaniel appeared without warning. He stood silently for a moment before speaking. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his tone lighter than usual. Elena Parker hadn't expected the question. Nathaniel Hayes rarely showed anything resembling concern. "I'm fine," she said quickly, her voice steady despite the exhaustion she felt deep inside. "Just tired, I guess." Nathaniel nodded, his expression unusually thoughtful. "If you need anything, just let me know. I don't want anything to jeopardize your health or the baby's." The words hung in the air and Elena wasn't sure how to react. His usual detached demeanor seemed to be softening, revealing a glimpse of something more human. Still, she wasn't ready to let her guard down. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked, her tone tinged with skepticism. "It doesn't seem like something you'd normally be concerned about." Nathaniel stared at her for a long moment, as though carefully weighing his response. "Because this will change everything," he said finally, his voice quieter but more sincere. "For me and for you." The honesty in his tone caught Elena off guard. For the first time, Nathaniel seemed less like the cold, calculating man she had agreed to work with. She looked away, refusing to acknowledge the unexpected vulnerability she saw in him. It was easier to think of him as just a wealthy man, focused on his own needs. Elena's days carried on with an outward semblance of calm, but inside, she was anything but. The pregnancy was progressing, and the physical changes made it impossible to ignore. Each flutter and movement of the baby filled her with conflicting emotions, a deep joy for the life growing within her, and a profound sadness, knowing she would have to give the child up. Nathaniel, surprisingly, was more present than she had anticipated. Though he remained guarded in many ways, his actions began to show a level of concern she hadn't thought him capable of. He insisted on attending every medical appointment, asked pointed questions of the doctors, and ensured she had everything she might need. Yet Elena kept her emotional defenses up. She didn't want to believe that Nathaniel genuinely cared, not about her at least. One sweltering morning, feeling restless, Elena decided to help Sophia, the housekeeper, organize the estate's sprawling library. She thought the physical activity might distract her from her spiraling thoughts. For hours, she climbed up and down a small ladder, dusting shelves, arranging books, and wiping away cobwebs from forgotten corners. By the time she finished, a wave of dizziness washed over her. She wobbled slightly before sinking to the floor, clutching her belly. "Elena!" Sophia cried, rushing to her side. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Elena replied, her voice thin as she tried to catch her breath. "I just need a moment." But the pain tightening in her abdomen told a different story. Without hesitation, Sophia grabbed the phone and called Nathaniel, who was in his office. Moments later, Nathaniel strode into the library, his steps quick and purposeful. His expression was sharp with worry. "What happened?" he demanded, his tone stern as his eyes locked onto Elena, still sitting on the floor. "I just overdid it a little," she said, attempting to downplay the situation. But the pained look on her face betrayed her words. Nathaniel's jaw tightened as he turned to Sophia. "Get the car ready. We're taking her to the doctor now." At the clinic, the doctor ran several tests while Nathaniel sat by Elena's side, his arms crossed and his expression grim. When the doctor finally returned with the results, his tone was firm. "Elena," he began, "your pregnancy requires more care. Stress and physical strain can cause complications. You need to rest more and avoid unnecessary activity. It's crucial to ensure the baby's health." Elena nodded, her face burning with embarrassment. She felt foolish for not being more careful, though all she had wanted was to feel useful. Nathaniel wasn't about to let the moment pass quietly. "You heard the doctor," he said, his voice low but commanding. "Rest, Elena. This isn't a suggestion. It's non-negotiable." He helped her to her feet with surprising gentleness, guiding her back to the car. The ride home was tense and silent. Elena stared out the window, avoiding Nathaniel's gaze, though she could feel the frustration radiating from him. When they arrived at the estate, he walked her to her room and stopped just outside the door. "Why do you keep pushing yourself like this?" he asked, his arms crossed. "Don't you understand that this isn't just about you anymore? There's another life depending on you." Elena took a shaky breath, holding back the sting of tears. "I know, Nathaniel, I know that better than anyone," she said quietly. "But I hate feeling useless." His expression softened for a moment, as though her words had struck a chord. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't about being useful or not. If you want to do something, do what's best for the baby, and that means resting." His tone was firm, but there was an underlying concern that surprised her. Too drained to argue, Elena simply nodded. In the days that followed, Nathaniel doubled down on ensuring she adhered to the doctor's orders. He reorganized the household's routines to keep her from overexerting herself, and even hired a nurse to check on her regularly. Though Elena resisted at first, she began to accept the changes, realizing they weren't just about control, they were about care. One afternoon, Nathaniel appeared at her door with a small tray of iced tea. "Thought you might need something to cool down," he said simply, placing it on the bedside table. Elena looked at him, her defenses wavering. "Thank you," she said softly, the sincerity in her voice catching even her by surprise. Nathaniel gave a brief nod before turning to leave. For a man who had always kept his distance, his actions now spoke louder than words. Little by little, the walls between them began to crumble. In the days that followed, Nathaniel Hayes became resolute in ensuring that Elena Parker adhered to the doctor's orders. He hired a nurse to monitor her health and rearranged the estate's household schedule to prevent Elena from taking on any tasks. Sophia, the housekeeper, took over all the chores Elena used to insist on doing. At first, Elena resented the restrictions, feeling as though her independence was being stripped away. But over time, she realized that Nathaniel's efforts weren't about control. They were about her well-being. Though strict, he seemed genuinely intent on making her feel as comfortable as possible. "You don't have to watch over me like a hawk all the time," Elena grumbled one afternoon as she sipped tea in the living room. Nathaniel, sitting at the other end of the room with a pile of documents in front of him, glanced up briefly. "It's not watching," he replied with calm precision. "It's precaution." Elena sighed, unable to argue. Deep down, she knew he was right. Sitting idle made her feel powerless, but she had to prioritize the baby. One day, Nathaniel arrived with a large package and placed it next to her chair. "What's this?" she asked, intrigued. "Something to keep you occupied without having to leave your seat," he said, pulling out a set of coloring books and pencils. "It might seem childish, but I've read that it's relaxing." Elena couldn't suppress her laughter. "You actually bought me coloring books?" Nathaniel gave a small, not almost imperceptible smile. "I don't see the harm in trying something new," he said, sitting back in his chair. "I might even join you." She studied him for a moment, trying to determine whether he was joking. It was hard to imagine the ever-serious Nathaniel Hayes picking up a colored pencil, but the gesture warmed her nonetheless. As the weeks passed, Elena began adjusting to her new routine. She spent more time reading, listening to music, and, to her own surprise, coloring. Nathaniel occasionally stopped by to sit with her, always offering a practical excuse. "I just want to make sure you're following the doctor's orders," he'd say as he settled into a chair nearby. Despite his formality, Elena started to notice subtle changes in him. He remained driven and focused, but there was a growing softness in his actions, a quiet attentiveness that hadn't been there before. One evening, while Elena sat on the porch enjoying the cool breeze, Nathaniel appeared with 2 mugs of tea. "I brought this for you," he said, handing her one. She accepted it, touched by the gesture. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's nice to feel cared for." Nathaniel sat down beside her, and for a while they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the rustle of the trees. Finally, he broke the quiet. "Elena," he began, his tone uncharacteristically gentle, "I know this hasn't been easy for you. I know I can come across as intense, but I want you to know I'm trying my best." His admission surprised her. She turned to look at him, her expression softening. "I know, Nathaniel," she said. "And despite everything, I do appreciate it." In that moment, something shifted between them. The rigid boundaries of their arrangement felt less defined, and a bond, one neither of them wanted to acknowledge, began to take shape. That afternoon, as Elena tried to distract herself with a book, her phone rang. It was her neighbor who had been helping care for her mother. "Elena, it's your mom," the neighbor said, her voice tinged with worry. "She's not doing well." Elena's heart sank. She hung up quickly and sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling. The weight of her helplessness overwhelmed her, and before she knew it, her breathing became shallow and erratic. Nathaniel, who had been in his office reviewing contracts, heard Sophia's hurried footsteps in the hallway. "Mr. Hayes," she said, knocking urgently. "It's Elena. Something's wrong." Without hesitation, Nathaniel strode across the halls and into Elena's room. He found her sitting on the floor, her hands clutching her head, gasping for air. "Elena," he said, kneeling beside her. "What's happening?" "I can't breathe," she managed, her voice breaking. Nathaniel grabbed a glass of water from the bedside table and held it out to her. "Drink this. Breathe slowly. I'm here," he said, his tone firm yet calming. Gradually, Elena's breathing steadied. Her hands still trembled, but the panic began to subside. Nathaniel helped her to her feet and guided her to sit on the bed. "Are you feeling better?" he asked, his voice serious but laced with concern. Elena nodded, but her tearful eyes betrayed her turmoil. "It was just a panic attack," she murmured, looking away. Nathaniel wasn't convinced. "It wasn't just that," he pressed. "What's going on, Elena?" She hesitated, reluctant to reveal the truth. Admitting her fears about her mother felt like baring her soul, something she wasn't ready for. But the genuine concern in Nathaniel's eyes disarmed her. "My mom," she said finally, her voice breaking. "She's getting worse. The surgery needs to happen soon, but I'm stuck here. I feel like there's nothing I can do to help her." Nathaniel was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. For the first time he saw the depth of what Elena was carrying alone. "Elena," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because it doesn't matter," she replied sharply, looking away. "I agreed to this arrangement to save my mother. I know the money will help, but until then, all I can do is wait, and it's unbearable." Nathaniel felt a pang of guilt. Until now, he had seen their agreement as a simple transaction. But hearing her pain, he realized that for Elena, it was so much more. She was sacrificing more than he had ever imagined. "You're not alone, Elena," he said after a moment, his tone quiet but firm. "I know it feels like the weight of the world is on your shoulders, but I'm here. If you need anything, anything at all, just tell me." Elena looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Despite the walls he usually kept so firmly in place, in that moment, Nathaniel seemed almost human. That same night, while Elena slept, Nathaniel picked up the phone and made a decision. He called his team and instructed them to investigate her mother's medical situation and resolve it immediately. The next day, Nathaniel visited the hospital himself. He signed papers, spoke to the administration, and ensured that the cost of the surgery and future treatments would be covered entirely. A few days later, Elena's phone rang. It was the hospital. "Miss Parker," the receptionist said, her voice professional but warm. "We're calling to inform you that your mother's surgery has been fully paid for. We can schedule the procedure in the coming days." Elena froze, nearly dropping the phone. "What do you mean? Who paid for it?" she asked, her heart racing. "I'm afraid we can't disclose that information, but all expenses have been covered," the receptionist replied. Elena thanked the caller and hung up, sitting on her bed in stunned silence. There was only one person who could have done this. Her mind raced as she processed the news. Determined to confront him, she made her way to Nathaniel's office. Pushing the door open without knocking, she found him seated at his desk, calmly reviewing documents. "Nathaniel, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice firm. He looked up, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Is something wrong?" "It was you, wasn't it?" she said, crossing her arms. "You paid for my mother's surgery." Nathaniel sighed and leaned back in his chair. "It wasn't exactly a secret that you needed help," he said evenly. "But why?" she pressed, her emotions a mixture of gratitude and confusion. He stood, walking toward her. "Consider it an advance on our agreement," he said. "Now just accept it and don't argue." Elena shook her head, torn between pride and relief. "I don't know how to thank you for this," she said quietly, "but this is more than I ever expected." "Then don't thank me," Nathaniel replied. "Focus on taking care of her." For a few moments, Elena stood in silence, overwhelmed by her emotions. "All right," she said finally. I accept. As she walked back to her room, her thoughts swirled. For the first time, she saw Nathaniel as more than just the cold, calculating man he presented to the world. Behind the rigid exterior was someone capable of genuine care. That night, Alina sat by the window, tears streaming down her face. The relief of knowing her mother would get the surgery she desperately needed was overwhelming. But the weight of everything else, the baby, the arrangement, and the subtle changes in Nathaniel, left her feeling conflicted. Meanwhile, Nathaniel returned to his work, but his mind wasn't focused on the numbers before him. He knew he was becoming more involved in Elena's life than he had intended. And yet, strangely, he didn't regret it. In the following days, Nathaniel began showing Elena more care. His gestures were small but thoughtful, an inquiry about how she was feeling, an offer to help with mundane tasks. Elena couldn't help but notice the shift in his demeanor. One evening, as she sat in the living room with a warm cup of tea, Nathaniel walked in with a package in his hands. I got something for you, he said, handing it to her. Curious, Elena opened it and found a soft, colorful blanket inside. It's for the colder nights, Nathaniel explained, looking slightly uncomfortable. Elena smiled, genuinely touched. Thank you, Nathaniel. It's beautiful. He nodded, seemingly relieved that she liked it. Taking a seat in a nearby armchair, he watched as she draped the blanket over her legs. You always try to handle everything on your own, don't you? He asked, breaking the silence. Elena looked up, surprised by the question. I guess I do, she said with a shrug. I've never really had a choice. It's always been just me and my mom. There was no one else to help. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. That explains a lot, he said, almost to himself. What do you mean? Elena asked, frowning slightly. You're different from the people I usually deal with, he said. Most of them have ulterior motives, but you just want to take care of your mother. His words struck a chord, leaving Elena momentarily speechless. She realized that Nathaniel was beginning to see her for who she truly was, and maybe, just maybe, she was starting to see him in a new light as well. As her pregnancy progressed, Elena's moments of vulnerability became more frequent. One day, while she was sitting in the garden, enjoying the warm breeze and trying to relax, Nathaniel appeared, carrying 2 chairs and a tray of juice. I thought you might enjoy some company, he said, setting the tray on a small table between the chairs. Elena smiled, touched by the gesture. Thank you, she said softly. They sat side by side in silence for a while, both enjoying the tranquility of the moment. After a while, Elena broke the silence. Have you always been this controlled? She asked, her curiosity piqued. Nathaniel turned to her, surprised by the question. Controlled? He repeated, thinking, maybe. I've always believed it was the only way to keep things running smoothly. And does it work? She pressed, leaning slightly toward him. Nathaniel was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Most of the time, yes, he admitted, but not always. His honesty caught Elena off guard. She could sense the cracks in his stoic exterior, and it made her feel closer to him. It was as though, little by little, the walls they had built around themselves were coming down. The connection between them continued to grow in subtle ways. Nathaniel started making more time to be around Elena, though he wouldn't admit it, even to himself. Something was changing within him, and while it unsettled him, he didn't shy away from it. For Elena, Nathaniel's presence was both comforting and confusing. She appreciated his attention, but it also left her feeling conflicted. She could sense that they were growing closer, but she was afraid of forming bonds that might eventually break. Both of them understood that the contract binding them together was no longer just a practical arrangement. It had become the foundation of something neither of them had anticipated, though neither was ready to define it. The atmosphere in the estate felt different since the night Nathaniel had comforted Elena. Their interactions had shifted subtly but unmistakably. He seemed more present, more attentive, and Elena found herself letting her guard down. The contract that had once seemed so significant now felt like a mere formality in the midst of something greater. One evening, while Elena was resting in the living room with a book, Nathaniel entered unexpectedly. Elena, tomorrow night, I'd like you to join me for dinner, he said, his tone formal yet tentative. She looked up from her book, surprised. A formal dinner? She asked, intrigued. Nathaniel hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "Consider it a gesture of gratitude," he said, "for what you're doing. You've gone through so much for something bigger than yourself. It's the least I can do." Elena felt a blush rise to her cheeks, and she quickly looked away, trying to hide her reaction. It wasn't what she had expected from Nathaniel, the man who had once treated her as just a part of a deal. "All right," she said, nodding. "A formal dinner it is." The following evening, Elena descended the grand staircase in a simple yet elegant dress Sophia had helped her choose. Her nerves surprised her. It was just dinner after all, but something about the way Nathaniel looked at her as he waited in the dining room made her feel unsteady. Nathaniel, dressed impeccably in a black suit, looked as sharp as ever, but there was something softer in his expression when he saw her. Rising from his seat, he walked toward her and pulled out her chair, a gesture she hadn't expected. "You look beautiful," he said casually but with sincerity. "Thank you," Elena replied, taking her seat. "You look formal." Nathaniel gave her a faint smile before sitting down across from her. The meal began in silence, the clinking of silverware the only sound in the expansive dining room. Feeling the tension, Elena decided to break the ice. "Do you often have dinners like this?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Nathaniel glanced up, his lips quirking in mild amusement. "No, not really. It's rare for me to have company during meals. Usually, they're just business meetings. I think I've forgotten what it's like to have a real conversation over dinner." Elena chuckled softly. "Well, at least now I know I'm not just another business transaction." Nathaniel tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. "You were never just a business transaction, Elena," he said, his tone unexpectedly gentle. "I think it took me a while to realize that." His words caught Elena off guard. She looked away, unsure of how to respond. The sincerity in his voice disarmed her in a way she hadn't anticipated. As the meal progressed, the conversation began to flow more naturally. Elena, feeling more at ease, opened up about her childhood. She spoke about growing up in a modest home, the challenges her family had faced, and the sacrifices her mother had made to give her a better life. "My mom has always been my inspiration," she said with a bittersweet smile. "She gave up so much for me. I guess that's why I'm doing all of this now. I want to make sure she has the chance to live without pain, without fear." Nathaniel listened intently, something rare for him. For the first time, he seemed genuinely interested in hearing about someone else's life. "She must be an incredible woman," he said after a moment, "and so are you." The compliment caught Elena by surprise, but she quickly changed the subject, uncomfortable with the emotion it stirred in her. "What about you?" she asked. "What was your childhood like?" Nathaniel hesitated, as though the question had caught him off guard. After a moment, he decided to share a little about himself. "It was complicated," he admitted. "My father was a demanding man. Everything was about meeting expectations. I think I became exactly what he wanted, but I'm not sure it made me happy." His vulnerability surprised Elena. For the first time, she saw a side of Nathaniel that he rarely showed, and it made her feel closer to him. Elena's brow furrowed slightly. "But did it make you happy?" she asked softly. Nathaniel let out a dry laugh. "Happiness wasn't the goal. Success was. But after he passed, I realized none of it meant anything if you don't have someone to share it with." There was a melancholy in his tone that Elena hadn't expected. For the first time, she saw Nathaniel not as a cold, calculating businessman, but as someone who carried deep scars of his own. As their conversation unfolded, Nathaniel opened up further, sharing bits of his past relationships. He spoke about the heartbreaks that had led him to distrust emotional connections. "People don't care about who you are," he said bitterly. "They care about what you can give them, and when they realize there's nothing left to take, they leave." Elena felt the weight of his words, and for a moment she saw the reason behind his cold demeanor. The walls he had built were not just for protection. They were a fortress of isolation. "Not everyone is like that, Nathaniel," she said gently. "Some people care about who you are, not what you have." Nathaniel looked at her, his gaze searching hers as though trying to determine if she truly believed her own words. "Maybe you're right," he said finally. "But it's hard to trust again when you've been betrayed so many times." Elena didn't respond, but her expression spoke volumes. She understood what it felt like to trust someone and be let down, though their experiences were vastly different. In that moment, she felt a connection with Nathaniel, something unspoken yet deeply resonant. When dinner ended, Nathaniel walked her to the living room. They sat on the couch, the silence between them now comfortable. "Thank you for dinner, Nathaniel," Elena said with a small smile. "It was different." "Different can be good sometimes," he replied, his tone soft. For a moment their eyes met, and Elena felt warmth rising in her cheeks. She looked away quickly, trying to hide the emotions stirring inside her. But deep down, they both knew that something was shifting. A bond was forming, even if neither of them was ready to admit it. The next morning was sunny as Nathaniel parked his car in front of the ultrasound clinic. Elena sat beside him, watching the people coming and going with a mix of curiosity and anxiety. "Are you ready?" he asked, turning off the engine and glancing at her. She nodded, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. It was an important moment, but the idea of sharing it with Nathaniel felt strange. His growing attentiveness left her feeling unsettled in ways she didn't entirely understand. They entered the clinic together, where the doctor greeted them warmly. After a few brief instructions, Elena was led to the exam room. Nathaniel stayed by her side, his usual serious expression intact, but his focus was unwavering. When the ultrasound began, the rhythmic sound of the baby's heartbeat filled the room. It was steady and strong, echoing softly in the quiet space. Nathaniel, who was used to being in control of every situation, sat completely still. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt something he couldn't quite explain. "This," the doctor said, pointing to the screen, "is your baby's heartbeat. Everything looks healthy and right on track." Nathaniel's eyes remained fixed on the grainy image on the monitor. This wasn't just an abstract plan or a theoretical arrangement anymore. It was a life, a child. His child. He couldn't look away. Elena, meanwhile, watched Nathaniel's reaction more than the screen. She saw the way his guarded exterior cracked, just for a moment, revealing something tender and unguarded. It moved her in a way she hadn't expected. Feeling the baby grow inside her had already been transformative. But seeing Nathaniel's reaction to the heartbeat made it all the more real. When the exam was over, Nathaniel finally turned to Elena, his eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't hide. "This is incredible," he said softly. "It's real." Elena smiled, sharing the sentiment, but deep inside she felt a pang of fear. With each passing day, they were growing closer, not just to the baby, but to each other. That realization made the thought of leaving after the baby's birth even harder. On the drive back, the car was filled with a heavy silence. Nathaniel, who always seemed to know what to say, appeared lost in thought. Elena stared out the window, struggling to quiet the emotional storm within her. "Thank you for letting me come with you," Nathaniel said finally, breaking the silence. "It was important for me too." Elena didn't look at him but replied quietly, "I think it's good to share moments like these." Nathaniel hesitated before speaking again. "I never thought something like this would affect me so much," he admitted. "I always saw it as a transaction. But today, hearing the heartbeat, I realized it's so much more than that." Elena turned to him, surprised by the sincerity of his words. Nathaniel rarely expressed his feelings so openly. "Yes," she said with a faint smile, "no matter how much we try to stay detached, this will always be bigger than us." For a moment, they looked at each other. Elena could see it clearly. Nathaniel was changing. He was no longer just the cold, calculating man she had first met. Something inside him was awakening, and while that unsettled her, it also gave her hope. In the weeks that followed, Nathaniel became more involved in the details of the pregnancy. He insisted on attending every appointment, even if it meant rearranging his demanding schedule. He began to ask questions that once seemed trivial, whether Elena was comfortable, if she needed anything, or if she had eaten properly. One afternoon, Elena stood in the kitchen, preparing a salad. She found the mundane task comforting, a way to regain a sense of normalcy. Nathaniel walked in, his arms crossed, and watched her with a slight frown. "You should be resting," he said, a hint of reproach in his tone. Elena laughed lightly, slicing a tomato. "Nathaniel, I'm just making a salad. I think I can handle this." He stepped closer and gently took the knife from her hand. "Let me do it. If the doctor said you need to rest, then rest," he said firmly. Elena sighed but relented, sitting on a nearby chair as she watched him awkwardly slice the tomatoes. "Who would have thought the great Nathaniel Hayes knows how to chop tomatoes?" she teased with a playful smile. "Don't spread that around," he replied with a smirk. "I have a reputation to maintain." They both laughed, the light-hearted moment easing the tension that so often lingered between them. Elena realized that, little by little, Nathaniel was allowing himself to be more human, more approachable. And she couldn't deny that she liked him more for it, even if she didn't want to admit it to herself. One evening, as Elena lay in bed reading, there was a knock on her door. Nathaniel entered hesitantly, holding a small package in his hands. "I brought something for you," he said, placing the package on her bedside table. Curious, Elena opened it to find a small, empty photo album. "I thought you might want to keep some memories of this journey," he explained, looking slightly uncomfortable. Elena felt her eyes fill with tears. It was a simple gesture, but it carried so much meaning. She smiled at him, deeply moved. "Thank you, Nathaniel. It's perfect." He nodded, lingering for a moment before quietly leaving the room. Alone, Elena stared at the album, her emotions swirling. She felt even more connected to him now, and the thought of saying goodbye after the baby was born seemed increasingly unbearable. For Nathaniel, the ultrasound had been a turning point. He could no longer ignore the emotions beginning to surface. The baby was no longer just a theoretical idea, it was real, and he felt a growing responsibility to be more than just a financial provider. He needed to be a father. Elena, on the other hand, was conflicted. She knew she was growing attached, not only to the baby, but also to Nathaniel. He was revealing himself to be someone entirely different from the man she had first agreed to work with. And while that made her heart ache with hope, it also filled her with fear. The contract still loomed between them, a constant reminder that everything they were building had an expiration date. In the days that followed, the tension between Elena and Nathaniel grew steadily, fueled by unspoken emotions and the barriers they both tried to maintain. Yet neither of them could deny that something was shifting. One quiet afternoon, Elena sat in the garden, flipping through the photo album Nathaniel had given her. She had already begun filling it with small mementos, notes from her doctor, sonogram pictures, and a dried flower she had picked during a walk. Nathaniel approached, pausing for a moment before sitting down beside her. The photo album caught his eye, and he gestured toward it. "Starting to fill it in?" he asked, his voice lighter than usual. Elena nodded. "I want to remember these moments," she said softly, "even if—" She trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. Nathaniel looked at her intently, his expression serious. "Elena," he began, "we need to talk about what comes next." The words sent a chill through her, and she closed the album carefully, bracing herself for what he might say. His formal tone wasn't a good sign. "About what?" she asked, her voice tinged with defensiveness. Nathaniel sat down beside her, placing the papers on the table between them. "It's about the contract," he said. "I want to make sure all the details are respected after the baby is born." Elena glanced at the papers, then looked away, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think it's good to share these moments," she said flatly, ignoring the subject. Nathaniel hesitated, his voice softening. "I never thought something like this would affect me so much. I always saw it as a transaction. But hearing the heartbeat, it changed things. It's so much more than that." Elena turned to face him, her composure cracking under the weight of his words. Though she had known this conversation was inevitable, hearing Nathaniel speak so coldly made her feel like she was being stripped of her humanity. "Right," she said, her voice sharp with sarcasm. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" Nathaniel met her gaze, struggling to find the right words. "I just want to make sure you're prepared to leave when the time comes," he said carefully. "I know it will be difficult, but it's important we stick to what was agreed upon." Elena closed her eyes for a moment, trying to suppress the storm of emotions rising within her. But the pain was too raw to contain. "Prepared?" she repeated, her tone bitter. "Do you really think it's that simple? That I can just walk away like none of this ever happened?" Nathaniel frowned, clearly taken aback by her reaction. "Elena, I didn't mean—" "No, Nathaniel," she interrupted, standing abruptly. "To you this is just a business deal, isn't it? A way to secure your precious heir. But for me this is my life, my body, my health, and my feelings. Nathaniel stood as well, his discomfort evident. "That's not fair," he said, his voice steady but strained. "I never said it was just a transaction." "That's exactly how you've treated it," Elena shot back, her voice breaking. "You never think about what I'm going through, about what this means for me." Her words cut deep, though Nathaniel tried not to show it. He knew he had been insensitive, but he wasn't prepared for the depth of Elena's anguish. "I know this is hard for you," he said, attempting to remain calm. "But it's not easy for me either. Do you think I don't feel anything? That this isn't affecting me too?" Elena stared at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Sometimes I think you're incapable of feeling anything, Nathaniel," she said softly. Her voice laced with both anger and sorrow. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging slightly as he searched for a way to make things right. "I'm not perfect, Elena," he said quietly. "I've never claimed to be, but I'm trying." Elena crossed her arms, her heart still pounding. "Then try harder," she replied firmly, "because so far all you've done is remind me that I'm temporary, disposable." Nathaniel stepped closer, his expression shifting from defensive to remorseful. "You're not disposable," he said earnestly, "and if I've made you feel that way, I'm sorry, truly." Elena looked away, tears spilling down her cheeks. His words sounded sincere, but the pain she felt wouldn't disappear so easily. "Sometimes," she murmured, her voice trembling, "I wish this contract had never existed, because the longer this goes on, the harder it gets." Nathaniel stood in silence, absorbing her words. For the first time, he truly understood the emotional toll this arrangement was taking on her. He had been so focused on logistics and obligations that he hadn't stopped to consider the depth of her sacrifice. "Elena," he began hesitantly, "I don't know how to undo what I've done, but I want to try. I want to do this in a way that doesn't hurt you anymore." She finally looked at him, her gaze searching his face. There was something different in his eyes. Not the usual cold detachment, but a warmth and humanity she hadn't seen before. "Then start by being honest," she said firmly. "Because if we keep pretending this doesn't matter, it's going to destroy us both." Nathaniel nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He realized he could no longer run from what he was feeling. He didn't know how to move forward, but he knew he had to try. The argument ended, but the tension lingered between them. Elena Parker sat alone in her room, staring at the photo album she had been filling with memories. Her emotions churned in a chaotic mix of anger and sadness. She wasn't just becoming attached to the baby, she was growing attached to Nathaniel Hayes as well, and that terrified her. Meanwhile, outside under the sprawling sky, Nathaniel gazed into the distance, searching for clarity amidst the turmoil in his mind. He knew he had to change, not because of the contract, but because of Elena. For the first time in his life, he cared about someone in a way he couldn't ignore. The day started quietly at the Hayes estate, but as the hours passed, Elena felt an unusual pressure in her abdomen. At first, she dismissed it, trying to go about her daily tasks, but the discomfort steadily grew into sharp pain. Nathaniel was in the library reviewing documents when Stephanie, the housekeeper, rushed in, her voice laced with urgency. "Mr. Hayes, something's wrong with Miss Parker," she announced, her face pale with worry. Nathaniel immediately dropped everything and hurried to Elena's room. When he entered, he found her sitting on the edge of the bed, struggling to breathe. Sweat beaded on her forehead and her hands trembled. "Elena, what's happening?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "I think," she gasped, her voice weak. "I think it's time. It hurts, Nathaniel." A knot tightened in Nathaniel's stomach at the sight of her so vulnerable. Without hesitation, he helped her stand and guided her carefully to the car. On the drive to the hospital, Nathaniel gripped the steering wheel tightly, his calm demeanor completely shattered. He kept glancing at Elena, his voice unsteady as he tried to reassure her. "It's going to be okay," he said, as much to himself as to her. Elena, despite the pain, noticed the worry etched deeply on his face. For the first time, Nathaniel seemed as human as anyone else. When they arrived at the hospital, a team of doctors and nurses quickly attended to Elena, wheeling her into the delivery room. Nathaniel, usually in control of every situation, found himself utterly powerless. In the waiting area, he paced back and forth, his mind racing. Every minute felt like an eternity. For a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life, this moment of complete vulnerability was overwhelming. Finally, a nurse entered, calling his name. "Mr. Hayes, Miss Parker has asked for you to join her in the delivery room." Nathaniel froze, surprised by the request, but he didn't hesitate. He followed the nurse, his heart pounding. Inside the delivery room, Elena lay pale but determined. When their eyes met, a wave of emotions swept over Nathaniel, leaving him breathless. "You came," she said with a weak smile. "Of course I did," he replied, stepping closer and taking her hand. "I'm not going anywhere." The labor was intense, and Elena gripped Nathaniel's hand tightly with every contraction. He stayed by her side, his voice soft and steady as he tried to comfort her. "You're doing great," he said, his usual sternness replaced by gentle encouragement. "I'm here, Elena. I'm with you." Elena couldn't respond, too focused on her breathing and the monumental effort of childbirth. Nathaniel, on the other hand, felt utterly helpless. He would have given anything to take away her pain, but all he could do was stay close and support her. Finally, the room filled with the sound of a baby's first cries. Nathaniel froze, his eyes fixed on the tiny life that had just entered the world. "It's a boy," the nurse announced, smiling as she handed the baby to Elena. Elena held her son for the first time, tears streaming down her face. "He's beautiful," she whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at the baby's flushed face. Nathaniel stepped closer, leaning in to see his son. The weight of the moment hit him like a wave. This wasn't just about an heir or a business transaction. This was his child. A powerful emotion he had never known surged through him. Nathaniel began, but his voice faltered. "He's incredible." Elena looked up at him, seeing an expression she had never witnessed before. Nathaniel's eyes were filled with tears, and for once, he didn't try to hide them. "Do you want to hold him?" Elena asked, offering the baby to him. Nathaniel hesitated for a moment, then gently took the baby into his arms. He looked down at the boy, marveling at the fragility and perfection of this tiny life. "Hello, little one," he said softly. "It's me, your dad." Elena watched the scene, her heart torn between joy and pain. She knew this moment was precious, but the contract loomed over them like a shadow, a constant reminder of the inevitable. After a few hours, Elena was moved to a recovery room. Nathaniel stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand as though afraid she might vanish. "Thank you, Elena," he said finally, breaking the silence. "For everything. I'll never be able to repay what you've done for me." Elena looked at him, exhausted but sincere. "I didn't do this for you, Nathaniel," she said quietly. "I did it for the baby and for my mother. But I'm glad he has you. He deserves to be loved." Nathaniel felt a lump in his throat at her words. He had spent so long thinking about what this child would mean for him, but now he realized the depth of Elena's sacrifice. Nathaniel Hayes sat in the corner of the hospital room, holding his newborn son in his arms. He studied every detail of the baby's face, as if trying to etch the moment into his memory. The weight of the tiny life in his hands was transformative, peeling away the cold, impenetrable facade he had built over the years. He was no longer just a calculating businessman or an arrogant millionaire. He was a father, and that changed everything. Elena Parker, peacefully asleep on the bed nearby, stirred slightly, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Nathaniel glanced at her, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He knew he had reached a crossroads. "I'm not going to let it end like this," he whispered to himself, his resolve hardening. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel was ready to fight for something that truly mattered. The next morning, a peculiar stillness hung over the Hayes estate. In the hospital room, Elena sat on the bed, cradling the baby in her arms. The boy slept soundly, unaware of the intense emotions surrounding him. For Elena, it was a bittersweet moment. Every second with her son felt infinitely precious, but the looming shadow of the contract reminded her that their time together was limited. Nathaniel sat nearby, watching them silently. For years he had prided himself on being methodical and detached, yet now as he observed Elena with their child, he realized there was something far greater at stake. "You seem deep in thought," Elena remarked, breaking the silence. Nathaniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I am," he admitted. "There's a lot I need to reconsider." Elena looked up at him, surprised by his candor. Until now, Nathaniel had been resolute about adhering to the contract. but something in his expression was different. "Nathaniel," she began hesitantly, "I know this situation isn't easy for either of us, but please, don't make it harder. When the time comes, just let me go. Don't prolong the inevitable." Her words cut through Nathaniel like a blade. A surge of anger rose within him, not at Alina, but at himself. At the man he had been when he signed such a cold, unfeeling contract, blind to the emotional toll it would take. "Do you think I want it to end like this?" he snapped, standing abruptly. "Do you think this was just a plan to me?" Alina stared at him, startled by the intensity of his reaction. "Nathaniel, I don't know what to think," she replied, her voice trembling. "You've always been so distant, so practical." Nathaniel exhaled sharply, running his hands over his face as if trying to calm himself. When he spoke again, his tone was softer, more vulnerable. "Maybe I was at first, but that's not true anymore. I can't ignore what I feel now." Elena averted her gaze, unable to look at him. "What do you feel?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel moved closer, kneeling beside the bed so their eyes were level. "I feel like I've done everything wrong," he admitted. "Like I treated you as part of a deal when you deserved so much more. Like I've tried to protect my heart for so long, but you've broken through all my defenses." Tears welled up in Elena's eyes, but she forced herself to stay composed. "Nathaniel, that doesn't change the fact that we have a contract," she said with difficulty. "A contract I agreed to because I had no other choice." Nathaniel shook his head and pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "Not anymore," he said, handing it to her. "This is the contract, or what's left of it." Alina opened the envelope with trembling hands, finding the torn pieces of the agreement inside. She looked at Nathaniel, disbelief etched across her face. "You tore up the contract?" she whispered. "Why?" Nathaniel took her hand, his eyes meeting hers with a sincerity she had never seen before. "Because I don't want you to leave, Alina. Not you, not the baby. I want you to stay, not out of obligation, but because this," he gestured between them, "this matters to me now." The tears Alina had been holding back finally fell. As much as she wanted to believe his words, the fear of being hurt again kept her guarded. "Nathaniel, you don't understand?" she said, her voice trembling. "It's not that simple." She paused, swallowing hard. "I don't know if I can trust you, not after everything." Nathaniel nodded, his expression steady. "I know it's not simple," he said, "and I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I'm willing to fight for this, for you, for our son, for us." Elena's heart raced as she looked down at the baby in her arms, then back at Nathaniel. There was something in his eyes, an unwavering determination, that made her believe he was telling the truth. "Are you really willing to change?" she asked, her voice trembling with both hope and doubt. "Yes," Nathaniel replied without hesitation. "For the first time in my life, I know exactly what I want, and it's you, Alina, you and our son." The silence that followed was heavy, but it carried a sense of hope. Alina searched Nathaniel's face, her mind and heart battling over what to say. Deep down, she knew she felt something for him too, something that scared her as much as it comforted her. Elena Parker hesitated before speaking, her emotions a whirlwind she could barely process. Deep down, she knew she felt something for Nathaniel Hayes, something that had grown quietly over the months. But admitting it was terrifying. "I'll try," she finally said, her voice trembling. "But I need time, Nathaniel. I need to know this isn't just a fleeting impulse." Nathaniel nodded, visibly relieved by her response. "I'll give you all the time you need," he said softly. "Just don't ask me to give up on you." In the weeks that followed, Nathaniel did everything he could to show Elena he was serious. He adjusted his schedule, clearing time to be with her and their baby. Business commitments that once seemed non-negotiable were set aside without hesitation. He supported her in every decision, demonstrated patience, and most importantly, he offered her genuine care. Little by little, Alina began to let her guard down. Though she still feared the possibility of being hurt, Nathaniel's consistent efforts gave her hope that they could build something real together. One warm afternoon, in the same garden where so many tense conversations had unfolded, Nathaniel cradled their baby in his arms. Alina sat nearby, watching him with quiet contentment. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the sunlight bathed them in comforting warmth. "I think we're finally on the right path," Nathaniel said, glancing between the baby and Elena. She smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest she hadn't experienced in years. "Maybe we are," she replied, reaching out to take his hand. Nathaniel looked at her, and in that moment, they both knew they were ready to face the future together. Not as part of a contract, but as a family. Months passed, and the Hayes estate transformed into a home brimming with life and laughter. Alina, now more at ease, spent her days caring for the baby and organizing small family moments with Nathaniel. Nathaniel, once a cold and calculating businessman, had become a completely different man. He was now a devoted father and a loving partner, willing to do anything for the people who meant the world to him. One of Elena's greatest joys was her mother's successful surgery. After years of worry and struggle, seeing her mother, Grace, healthy and full of energy was an indescribable relief. Grace often visited the estate, enchanted by her grandson and thrilled to witness the transformation in both her daughter and Nathaniel. One quiet evening, Nathaniel surprised Alina with a special request. "I'd like you to dress up for dinner in the garden tonight," he said with a soft smile. Though puzzled, Alina agreed. When she stepped outside, she was greeted by a breathtaking sight. The garden was illuminated by soft, twinkling lights, with rose petals scattered across the ground. Beneath an elegant arch of flowers stood a table set for two, glowing under the moonlight. "What is all this, Nathaniel?" Alina asked, astonished, as he led her to the table. "Just a night to celebrate everything we've built together," he replied, his calm demeanor tinged with warmth. "You deserve it." The dinner was filled with laughter and shared memories. Nathaniel was more relaxed than Alina had ever seen him, and with every passing moment she felt more connected to him. When the meal ended, Nathaniel stood and walked toward her. His eyes held a mix of nervousness and determination as he gently took her hands. "Alina," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "I never imagined I'd meet someone like you. When you came into my life, I thought this would just be a cold transaction. But you brought warmth, love, and purpose. You've changed me in ways I never thought possible." Tears welled up in Elena's eyes as her breath caught in her throat. "I love you, Elena," Nathaniel continued, "and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, opening it to reveal a delicate diamond ring. "Will you do me the honor of being my wife?" Elena covered her mouth with her hands, unable to hold back the smile and tears that blended together. For a moment, everything felt surreal. But deep down, she knew her answer. "Yes, Nathaniel," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I will." Nathaniel slid the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into a tight embrace before kissing her with all the love he felt. The baby, sitting nearby in a stroller, let out a happy noise, as if celebrating with them. Both Nathaniel and Alina laughed, their joy uncontainable. A few months later, Nathaniel and Alina married in an intimate ceremony held in the garden of the Hayes estate. The guest list was small: close friends, loyal staff, and Grace. Alina looked radiant in a simple yet elegant white dress that accentuated her natural beauty. Nathaniel, in a sharp black suit, couldn't take his eyes off her. Grace Parker sat in the front row, her grandson nestled in her arms, as she watched Elena walk down the aisle with Nathaniel waiting at the altar. Grace's heart swelled with gratitude. After enduring a risky surgery, she was now witnessing this profound moment in her daughter's life, a culmination of love and resilience. As Elena walked toward Nathaniel, carrying their baby boy, Nathaniel felt emotions overwhelm him. His usual composure crumbled as tears threatened to spill. The journey that had brought them here was anything but conventional, but it had forged something extraordinary. When they exchanged vows, every word seemed to solidify the bond they had worked so hard to build. "I promise to stand by your side through every moment," Nathaniel said, holding Elena's hands tightly. "You are my home, my heart, and the greatest gift life has ever given me." Elena, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, responded, "Nathaniel, you gave me hope when I thought all was lost. I promise to love and support you in everything, because you are my safe harbor." As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the small group of family and friends erupted in applause. Nathaniel pulled Elena into a tender, passionate kiss, sealing the promise of their new life together. From her seat, Grace smiled, her voice trembling with emotion as she cradled her grandson. "You are my greatest joy," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Months after the wedding, the Hayes family's home was brimming with love and laughter. The mansion that once felt like a cold fortress was now warm and lively, filled with the sounds of family. Elena spent her days caring for their growing family, while Nathaniel balanced his work with an unwavering commitment to being present. He had become a man transformed, a devoted father and loving husband who cherished every moment with his family. One morning, as Elena prepared breakfast, she began feeling unusually nauseous. At Nathaniel's insistence, she visited the doctor. The appointment brought news that changed everything once again. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hayes," the doctor said with a smile. "You're pregnant again, and this time it's twin girls." Elena sat in stunned silence before a wave of joy washed over her. She could hardly wait to share the news with Nathaniel. When she told him later that evening, Nathaniel froze for a moment, processing the information. "Twins?" he asked, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Yes," Elena replied, laughing at his expression. "Are you ready for this?" Nathaniel let out a laugh before pulling her into a tight embrace. "If it's with you," he said, his voice filled with love, "I'm ready for anything." The months leading up to the twins' arrival were a whirlwind of preparation and excitement. The Hayes family transformed the mansion further, creating a true home filled with laughter and precious memories. When the twin girls were born, Nathaniel held them in his arms, tears streaming down his face. For the first time in his life, he felt truly complete. One quiet evening, the family gathered in the living room. Their son, now almost 2 years old, giggled as he played on the floor, while the twins slept peacefully in a nearby crib. Elena sat cross-legged, organizing toys as Nathaniel watched her from across the room. A warmth he had never known filled his chest as he approached her and hugged her from behind. "Thank you," Nathaniel said softly, resting his chin on her shoulder. "For what?" Elena asked, turning to look at him. "For teaching me what love is," he replied, kissing her forehead gently. Elena smiled, taking his hand in hers. "And thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "for giving me a family." As they stood together, surrounded by their children and the life they had built, the weight of their journey felt worth it. For Nathaniel, who had once been a cold and lonely man, and for Elena, who had faced so many struggles, this was more than just a happy ending. It was a new beginning, a life filled with love, hope, and unshakable happiness. What do you think of Nathaniel's transformation and his journey with Elena? Share your thoughts in the comments and rate the story from 0 to 10. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated with more emotional stories.